Every story leaves something behind: a whisper, a shadow, a question that was never answered. Here, we dig through the forgotten files, the unsolved mysteries, the chilling true crimes, and the horrors people wish had stayed buried. From haunted legends to real-life nightmares, every tale is pulled straight from the horror archives. So turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and step carefully, because once a story enters the horror archives, it never truly leaves.
Tonight we have 3 stories, all set in basements. There's something about being underground, below the rest of the world, that makes you feel like normal rules don't apply down there. These are all real accounts submitted by real people, and none of them end the way you want them to. Our first story tonight comes from a listener in Ohio who moved into a duplex and noticed something wrong almost immediately. A stain on the ceiling, a smell he couldn't place, and a warning carved into the wood that someone left behind for whoever came next. The stain on the basement ceiling was growing. I noticed it the first week after I moved into the duplex. Just a faint yellowish ring near the far corner, maybe the size of a dinner plate. But by the second week it had doubled, and there was a smell. Not mildew exactly, something sweeter, heavier. I was 24, renting the lower unit of an old duplex in Dayton, Ohio. The basement was shared technically, but the upstairs tenant had his own entrance and I had mine. A narrow wooden staircase behind a door in my kitchen. The basement itself was unfinished. Concrete floor, exposed joists, a single bare bulb on a pull chain that lit maybe a third of the space. The rest just sort of faded into shadow. There was an old water heater, a circuit breaker panel, and a drain in the center of the floor that always had a thin film of dark water sitting in it. I went down there to check the stain from below. I could see where the moisture was seeping through the subfloor, darkening the wood. It was directly beneath the upstairs tenant's kitchen. I figured a pipe was leaking. I texted my landlord. He said he'd send someone. No one came. A few days later, the smell got worse. I started keeping the basement door closed, but it crept through anyway. I texted the landlord again. Nothing. I knocked on the upstairs tenant's door to ask if he'd noticed anything. No answer. His car was in the driveway though. It was always in the driveway. I realized I hadn't actually seen him in over 2 weeks. That night I went back down to the basement with a flashlight to see if the leak had gotten worse. It had. The stain on the wood above was almost black now, and it was dripping. Slow, thick drops falling onto the concrete below. The puddle on the floor was dark. I told myself it was rust from old pipes. I moved the flashlight beam along the joists and noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the far wall, in the part of the basement that stayed dark, there were scratches on one of the support beams. Not random marks, letters. Someone had carved them into the wood, probably years ago. They said, "Don't open the wall." I looked at the wall behind the beam. It was drywall, which was strange because every other wall down there was bare concrete block. This one section, maybe 4 feet wide, had been drywalled over and painted to roughly match the concrete. I probably never would have noticed if I hadn't been standing right in front of it. I put my hand on the drywall. It was warm, not from a pipe or a heater, just warm, and the smell was strongest right there. I called the police for a welfare check on the upstairs tenant. They came the next morning. He didn't answer. They went in. His apartment was empty, not like he'd moved out, like he just stopped being there midday. Coffee mug on the counter, TV still on. His phone was on the kitchen table. The police never found him. The landlord finally sent a plumber who said nothing was leaking. He couldn't explain the stain or the dripping. I moved out 11 days later. I never touched that drywall. I think about what was behind it almost every night. I think about the fact that whoever carved that warning, they knew, and they left it there for whoever came next. That one is hard to shake. The idea that someone tried to warn him, and he listened. But the next story might be even harder to explain. This one was sent in by a listener who was house-sitting for a relative. He found something in the basement that shouldn't have been there, and when he went back to prove it, it was gone. I heard the breathing before I found the door. It was coming from behind the furnace, a low rhythmic sound that I mistook for the heating system cycling on. But the furnace wasn't running. It was July. I was house-sitting for my aunt in Scranton, Pennsylvania. She'd gone to visit family in Ireland for 3 weeks and asked me to water her plants and keep an eye on things. The house was a narrow row house built in the 1920s, with a basement that looked like it hadn't been updated since. Stone foundation walls, a coal chute that had been sealed over decades ago, and a massive old iron furnace that took up most of the back wall. The ceiling was so low I had to duck under the ductwork. The only light was a single fluorescent tube that flickered and buzzed like it was dying. I'd been staying there for about 5 days when I heard the sound. I was in the kitchen making dinner, and the sound was coming up through the floor, muffled but steady. I went to the basement door and listened. It was clearer there. In, out, slow and deep, like someone sleeping. I went down. The fluorescent light took a few seconds to sputter on. The basement looked the same as always. Boxes, old furniture, the furnace. I walked toward the sound. It was definitely coming from behind the furnace, from the back wall. I squeezed into the gap between the furnace and the stone, and that's when I saw the door. It was small, maybe 4 feet tall, set into the stone wall. It had a latch but no lock. I'd been in this basement several times that week, and I had never noticed it because the furnace blocked the view from every other angle. The breathing sound was coming from behind it. I did not open it. I went back upstairs and called my aunt. She picked up despite the time difference. I asked her about the door behind the furnace. There was a long pause. She said there was no door behind the furnace. I told her I was looking right at it. She said the back wall was solid stone, that the house backed up to the neighboring row house's foundation. There was nowhere for a door to lead. She told me to leave it alone. Her voice had changed. She wasn't confused anymore. She sounded afraid. She said her husband, my uncle who passed away 4 years ago, had told her the same thing once, that he'd found a small door behind the furnace. She said she went down to look, and there was no door, just stone wall. She said he never brought it up again, but he stopped going into the basement entirely after that. I hung up and went back to the basement. The breathing had stopped. I squeezed back behind the furnace with my phone light. The door was still there. I put my ear against it. Silence, then very faintly, a knock. From the other side, 3 slow knocks evenly spaced. I left the house that night. I stayed at a motel until my aunt came back. When she returned, I went with her to the basement. I moved the flashlight behind the furnace to show her. There was no door, just rough stone wall, same as the rest of the foundation. She looked at me and didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I don't go to her house anymore. She told me last Thanksgiving that she sometimes hears the breathing too, late at night, coming up through the kitchen floor. She says she just turns up the TV. There's a door that only some people can see, and something behind it that knocks back. I don't know what to do with that one, but this last story, this is the one that genuinely disturbed me. It's not supernatural. It's completely real, and that's what makes it worse. This was submitted by a woman who rented a basement apartment in Maryland. She thought she was living alone. She wasn't. The camera was inside the vent. I only found it because I dropped a quarter and it rolled against the wall. And when I crouched down to get it, I saw the tiny glass lens staring back at me through the slats of the floor-level vent. I need to back up. In 2019, I was renting a basement apartment in a house in suburban Maryland, just outside of College Park.
And that's where tonight's file closes, but the archives are far from empty. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover more horrors, mysteries, and true crimes hidden in the horror archives. Until next time, keep the lights low, keep listening, because you never know what story we'll uncover next.